Alrighty, we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a very special 60-day novel challenge event, a workshop that is all about creating awesome characters and focusing on character development. My name's Doug Lansborough. You probably recognize me from past 60-day events or other videos if you've been around. If you haven't and you're new to the channel or Dabble in general, welcome. Happy to have you here. I encourage everyone in the chat to say hi, where you're from, what you're working on, anything you want, really. Just let me know you're out there in cyberspace. We're gonna stall for a couple minutes here while we let everyone trickle in. I never like to start on the hour, just because I know life gets busy. People take their time. We have Jacob in the chat here, just speaking truth. Jacob is my boss. Jacob's the founder of Dabble, so it's awesome to have him around. Not like he's, reviewing my performance or anything. So we have Ruth from England. Hello, Ruth. Welcome. Resist to Nothing from Seattle. Ilsa, still from the Netherlands, as always. Pleasure to have you back, Ilsa. We have Linnea from Sweden. Alicia also here. Alicia is one of our fantastic dev teams, or member of the dev team here at Dabble. The warning, the threat. Now the pressure's on. And we have Purple Conundrum from the wild Pacific Northwest near Olympia, which might mean something to someone who's more geographically inclined than I am. I'm coming at you from just north of Toronto in Ontario, Canada. It is rainy today. I always joke when we put on these workshops, which is normally a Dabble Premium experience, and this is a workshop we have done in the past for Dabble Premium subscribers. I always joke that the workshop day, it can be sunny for 3 weeks beforehand. The workshop day, it's always rainy. It's always thundering. And a couple workshops ago, I lost power in the middle of a workshop. And so it is raining. It actually looks like it's brightened up a little bit through the window there. But if the power does cut, if I suddenly just vanish like that, please hang around for 5 minutes. I'll scramble to get back and finish this up. But fingers crossed, everything's looking good out there. We have a lot more people joining us in as well. Ka from Germany, Shelly from the Pacific Northwest, Portland. Ray is here. Hello, Ray. Jane, also from Canada. Awesome. Bet from Texas. Richard, not from Canada. And Jane from Puyallup. Forgive me if I mispronounced that. That's a cool word, though. I do see some familiar faces from the 60-day challenge community too, as well. So if you haven't joined the challenge community yet, I'm going to drop a link in the chat here over at the Storycraft Cafe. That's where we have all our discussions. We ask questions. We support one another. This is an event in the series as we're going through this challenge. If you're participating, awesome. This is going to be super helpful for you for this week's content when we talk about it on Thursday. If you aren't joining us in that challenge, that's okay. I hope you get a lot of valuable information from this. Okay, we're going to give another minute or so to let any of the stragglers kind of join us, and then we will hop right into it. You all up. Cool. Thank you. Thank you for the pronunciation. And Jacob is excited to see everyone here. Awesome. Yes, see, now you're making me look good too. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Try not to make too many boss jokes, because I know they can get stale, but I find them hilarious. I will encourage everyone to open up a Google Doc or a Word doc or a note in Dabble, or grab a pen and paper. There are going to be exercises as we go along. They are not mandatory. I'm not giving you homework, but if you want to practice the stuff that we're talking about here, then that gives you the opportunity to. All right. By my count, I'm going to say another 30 seconds. We'll hit the 2:05 mark, 2:05 Eastern, just for whatever your time zone is, and then we will get into it. Awesome. Okay. And I hope people, I think Florida, if we have anyone from Florida, let me know how the weather is down there. I know something nasty is brewing. But otherwise, I love seeing people from all over the world here as well. So with that said, saying how happy I am with our audience, let's jump into this. I'm actually going to adjust myself a little bit there. There we go. Okay, cool. The 60-day novel challenge character development workshop. The idea of this workshop, it's going to be a long one. We're probably going to be here for 2 hours. If the last time I did this was any indication, we will be talking about everything from conception to character arcs in this, and then tying it all together at the end. I will go over some rules, some housekeeping, and whatnot. I do encourage everyone to participate, to share your answers. The general rule of thumb here is if you want to share and you are okay with myself commenting on anything you share or somebody else commenting on it, you just share it as is. But if you don't want anyone to comment on it, if you just want to do it for accountability or to participate in the answers, put a little asterisk at the front. I might read a smidgen of it out loud as I'm just kind of mumbling to myself, but I won't provide any feedback or anything like that. And I ask that anyone in the chat abides by the same rule. If you see an asterisk at the front of a comment, it's just there for accountability. Alrighty, and we have TW, a regular here. Hello, TW. Okay, here we go. That said, let's check out our agenda. Introduction. You are here with me right now and everyone else. We're going to dive into what character development is, look at traits and backstory and motivations and goals. Then we're going to look at some more in-depth while you're writing kind of stuff, and that's character arcs, conflicts, relationships, and the climax of your novel. Then we're going to take some time at the end to put it all together. I am reserving some time at the end for Q&A. You are more than welcome to ask questions along the way if I can fit them in, if they're immediately relevant to the topic that we're on. I will try and answer them then and there. Otherwise, I have a little bank going where I'll save them till the end, and I'll be sure to answer it then. Kimberly, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Okay, who am I? Hi, I'm Doug. I've written over 100 articles and 2 ebooks with Dabble. Been here for a handful of years now. I have 5 novels. 3 of them were #1 new releases. One was a #1 bestseller. In my spare time, when I'm not writing or working and doing this cool stuff, I'm an editor, husband, dog dad, nerd. Thursdays are D&D nights. I always say Halloween's one of my favorite times of year because I get all these horror movies that are coming out. It's excellent for me. Quick question. Oh, Purple Conundrum here. Do we post our sharing in here? Yes. So you have a couple options. You can answer them in the chat here because the activities will be on the screen. You'll be able to see them, and you can just post them here. Or you can bank them, turn them into a doc. You can put them in the share your work space in the 60-day community if you'd like. And we have Chris from North Carolina, Janet from California. Fantastic. Awesome to see everyone. Okay, couple of expectations. Ask questions. This is a completely open forum. I don't want anyone to feel intimidated, so please feel free to ask questions. Let's try and keep them relevant to character development, but if you have a question about Dabble, if you have a question about storytelling that's, tangentially related to the characters, feel free to drop it in there. Again, if it's immediately relevant to the slide or topic we're on, I'll answer it as soon as I can. Otherwise, we bank it till the end. Collaborate means help one another out. If someone has a question and you have an answer to it, and I haven't noticed it yet or haven't got there, then feel free to drop your answer. Right? We're all authors here. We're all passionate about writing. We all have different areas of expertise and experience. So please feel free to collaborate with one another and be kind. This has never been an issue so far. We're almost into double digits of workshops now, and no one's ever not been kind to one another. But got to give the fair warning: if you are not kind, you get booted out. Easy as that. Okay. So let's dive into it. What is the big deal about character development? Why do we even care? So, character development is the process of creating and evolving characters who are believable, relatable, and integral to your story. Proper development ensures characters feel real and create a connection with readers while driving the plot and themes you want to share. Characters do so much work for our stories. I can't emphasize that enough. I love sword fights. I love magic. I love plot twists. I love spooky things. I cannot deny that characters make stories great. And if you don't have a well developed character, your reader doesn't have anyone to latch onto to experience this story. They need that connection, and these characters serve as guides. On top of that, they help us with the plot. Right? They are the source of conflicts. They provide obstacles. They help one another. They hinder one another. They experience growth that makes it meaningful, and they can push themes for us as well. They do a lot of work, and a character will not be good if you don't take the time to develop them well. Before I hop on to the next one, Ray, yeah, giving me a big old smile here, and healthy level of excitement. I love that. Tom joining us from New York as well. All right. So I like to break up character development into two phases, and they are linked. They are inseparable, but it helps me categorize them, and hopefully it will help you as well. Because when you're developing something, you start with something, you end with something, and there's the thing that bridges those two, right? So we start with something that happens before the story, who your character is before you start writing that first page. That's character traits, their values and beliefs, their voice, their backstory, their motivation, and their goals. All very important things, but some of those things won't actually be explicitly mentioned on any page that you write. They inform how your character operates and how they act, but you might not ever say, hey, this is my character's complete history. Here's their familial relationships, a family tree or whatever, but it will still inform their actions. Then we have during the story, the part two. That's where you find your character arcs, your external and internal conflict, you develop relationships, and you get to the climax of your story, which is also for your protagonist the climax of their journey. And the intersection point of external and internal conflicts. These two things work together. You can't have that stuff happening during the story, which is arguably the juiciest stuff, the most exciting stuff. You can't have that unless you have the stuff that comes before the story to establish that groundwork. So I'm passionate. I love this workshop. I love talking about this, but to give myself a second to catch my breath, to have a sip of water, feel free to share in the chat here some of your favorite characters, whether you've written them or read about them or watched them in a movie. What made you love them? I am a sucker for morally gray anti-heroes. You write that, and I will probably read your book, cover to cover in a matter of days. Bread and butter. Empire the Vampire, probably one of my favorite books ever. And the main character, Gabriel de Leon, he is such a fun, angsty, vice-ridden character that is just enjoyable to read. Really brings the world to life in a way that is, he's a hero, but he doesn't really act like one, and he's not, pious and uppity and like. If you think about the Dungeons and Dragons movie, Honor Among Thieves, for anyone who saw that, there was a paladin in that who was very, shoulders back, chest puff, doing the right thing every single time. And it was funny for the bit, but I love the exact opposite. I love the ones that operate in that gray area. Okay. Alicia and Purple both share my favorite kinds of characters. Awesome. Helen has Lisbeth from The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Excellent. Yes. Amos from The Expanse. Okay, I'm gonna be honest. I haven't read The Expanse, and I don't think I watched past season one, despite everyone saying it was fantastic. It's on the list. There's just a really big list to get to. uh, Richard likes writing real people who traverse life against real problems and real obstacles. That's awesome. That's fantastic. I like writing fantasy. Very different, but you'll find even if you aren't writing literary fiction, if you aren't writing, true to life kind of stuff, you're still going to be embarking on the same journey with your characters, right? Because our characters are the anchors for readers, we need them to have real problems. Even if the problems are huge, even if they're king and queen level problems or universal problems, we still need to humanize them. We need to have that connection. So I really like that answer because I think that's applicable to a lot of people. And then Purple likes the textured and interesting characters that don't always fit the mold. Fantastic. Okay. So let's jump right into it. No dilly-dallying here. Let's talk about all the stuff that comes before the story. We're starting with character traits, and these are the qualities and attributes and characteristics that define who your character is. It defines their personality. It's also a good description of their physical experience. It's important. They are important because primarily they make your character more memorable. We can all kind of think of character traits off the top of our head, like a tattoo or scar or hairstyle or fashion choice or eye color, hair color, skin color. All of these are traits that can be very superficial and they are just meant to make your reader remember who the character is. Now, that doesn't mean that they're only superficial, right? Especially for things like skin color, or if you're writing something like fantasy and there's a curse mark or something, or or a mark of a blessing or something like that, something physically distinguishing, that might have a deeper meaning in your story. But for the most part, character traits are more catalysts or attributes that we use for development. They are not the most important parts of development. So, some important traits to think about though: personality, strengths, and flaws. And we're going to dive into flaws, especially in this workshop, because that is such a great area to pull stuff from when you're writing. And then the basic one is their physical description, right? Eye color, hair color, skin color, clothing choice, birthmarks, that kind of stuff. Purple says here, I tend to write a lot in development sketches about what they're wearing, which you can. And sometimes what people wear is very important, and it is representative of their values. It's representative of who they are. But for a lot of cases, traits as a whole are a little shallower than that. Now, if you choose to go deeper, that's fantastic. Okay. So we can break traits down into three kind of categories that you can operate within. You have your physical traits. I've mentioned those a handful of times already. You have personality traits, outgoing, introverted, stubborn, compassionate, anxious, brave, all these sorts of things that kind of define how the character thinks, how they operate. And then there's the behavioral traits, which are more like their habits, their quirks, their mannerisms that really make them unique. And you'll note these kind of funnel downwards from very broad to very specific when it comes to a character. You can have characters that have a lot of the same physical traits. You don't necessarily want a whole cast of characters with very similar character traits, because remember, traits are how our readers kind of anchor themselves to a character. So if multiple characters share a lot of the same traits, it might be a little muddling for the reader. But as you get further and further down these traits, it gets it gets a little deeper, right? I need this in more of my workshops. And Jacob here with Dabble tips. You can create notes within and underneath your character profiles. Lets you have the highlights and overview of your character in the profile and explore backstory and voice in separate notes. Jacob, if you're around to the end of this, or somebody who's going to be hanging around till the end of this, remind me to show you what that looks like, because I can pull up my own Dabble and let you know. And Purple saying here, they all layer on top. Yes, exactly. And there's that intersection point is where it gets quite deep, right? That's where your character becomes very unique. Because even though a lot of characters can share physical traits, they can share personality and behavioral traits as well, right? But it's that intersection that makes them really stand out. So I wanted to cover traits first because we won't be talking about a lot of them throughout this. It doesn't take a workshop to understand, you can have different physical characteristics, or your character thinks and thus has a personality unto themselves. We're going to go deeper than that. So we're going to, here's your first exercise. If you're following along on a doc or in a note in Dabble, or if you just want to share it in the chat here, identify 3 to 5 core traits that make your character distinct from others, or that makes them identifiable. And then this is a bit of a longer exercise, something to think about later. Brainstorm 1 or 2 ways these traits might intersect and make things more complex for the character. Because everything we include in a story should be intentional, and it should serve a purpose. So if we are giving a character all of these unique things and they can intersect to make something happen, let's make something happen. Let's use it to create an obstacle, or let's use it to give them a strength that will be tested. Let's use it to stress or develop relationships. If you start thinking in that way, yes, there are some superficial things. I give characters brown or red or black hair just because they might have, like, I just need them to have a hair color. But sometimes a hair color can be very important, right? Or it might be in your world building, it's a little more important, or it might intersect with something else. Like a prophecy might speak of a redheaded, bearded guy wearing glasses and how he's going to conquer the world one day or something. I don't know. But when you start thinking about deeper things like that, even for stuff like traits, then you can start coming up with more nuanced characters and really tie them into your story more. And Jacob, yeah, I'll do that too. Okay. And so for the exercises as well, I will post a copy of all of these exercises in the cafe once we're done here. It won't be on, a nice fancy doc. We do have one of the premium perks is that we do have downloadable resources with the workshops, but I will post the questions so you can access them. You don't need to go through and pause the video just to follow along with the exercises. I'll post them in the cafe once we're done here. So, if we want to get a little bit deeper, we're then going to start talking about values and beliefs. And now we're really getting deeper, right? We went from the shallow end right to some of the deeper parts of character. Values and beliefs define how your character makes decisions. They are like the driving force of a lot of what your character chooses to do. They're similar, but they're kind of different as well. Values are the principles or standards important to the character. So honesty might be important to them, loyalty, independence, strength, bravery, what have you. Beliefs are convictions or acceptance that certain things are true or real, often shaped by external forces. So their upbringing, culture, or experiences. These are things like faith, but they're also things like if something traumatic or exceptional happened in their past, that might create some kind of belief. And we're going to talk about a big core belief soon. That I'll get really excited about. If you were here for the workshop the first time around, you know how passionate I get about this. But these are very important things for your character. And if you can kind of flesh out these traits, then you can start thinking more in your character's shoes. So start doing that by thinking about what ideals, principles, or beliefs your character holds most dear, because they do impact the decisions. They impact everything. If you personally hold something to be true or to be a very, a very strong core value of yours, it influences everything you do, even if it's not a conscious decision to let it influence that. Right? It is part of who you are, and thus it is something that helps guide you to a destination. You can also take these things and do one of my favorite things, which is, as writers, probably all of our favorite things, is start thinking about conflicts that you can come up with due to their values and beliefs. This is a great source of tension in your novel, and tension is what readers are here for. We will talk about conflict in a little bit, but readers want conflict. We need conflict in a book to promote growth, and this is a great place to pull it from. We have Kara here. Is it possible to import character notes from one story outline to another? Not a dumb question, no such thing. And Alicia answered. There we go. I'm going to actually star that so that I can show it off at the end too. So, if you want to do more exercises, and again, if you want to share the answer to your exercises, I'm going through these initial ones a little bit faster than some of the later ones. And I can make a conscious effort to slow down here, but start thinking about the core values of your character. What are the values or beliefs that are most important to them? This is great work to do whenever you're coming up with a character for your story. It's essential for your protagonist, and it will make your secondary characters that much stronger if you put in this little bit of pre-work. And this will start bleeding into everything else. Then once you've come up with the 2 or 3 core values or beliefs, summarize a moment when that belief system could be challenged. Think of something that might press this character to doubt themselves or to seek validation, or if you're writing, dark stuff like me, when their belief falters and what the ramifications are of that. Richard here saying core values and core beliefs are different things. Yes. Yes, they are. All right. So now we're going to move on to voice. Voice is an element of character that I think is really undervalued by newer authors, but is something that we all appreciate when we see it. Is a strange way of saying it because you tend not to see it. You just kind of it's there. It makes the character experience better. And so voice is less about developing a character and it is more the outcome of good development. But it is something that will make your character more memorable. So the way your character speaks and communicates in general is their voice. And it takes into account everything about them. Takes into account their personality, their background, their motivations, their defense mechanisms, their coping mechanisms, and their emotional state. It everything kind of comes together, gets thrown into a pot, and the result is their voice, right? And how they speak, how they communicate with others, the tone that they have, the words that they choose, it's all influenced by this. And so when we're thinking about development, we take all of these other elements that we're going to be talking about and those last two ones, the traits and the values and beliefs, and we blend them all together. And the result is a very distinct voice. And I'm currently listening to Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie. And because I'm an editor and because I get to put on awesome workshops like this, whenever I'm reading or listening to something, I'm also dissecting it from a storytelling point of view. And Joe Abercrombie does such a good job with character voice. It is astounding how well he does. The narrative perspective shifts when it's from a character's point of view, which it should, but it is so distinct in the voice that you have one character that's very proper and very conceited, and that comes across in how the prose is written. And then you have another character who's doubting himself and who's worried all the time, and that affects the prose and how they interact with others. Right? And you'll see here the second point, it's more than just dialogue and it's more than just thoughts. It is that narrative perspective as well. This is true if you're writing first person. This is true if you're writing third person limited. If you're writing third person omniscient, character voice doesn't necessarily influence the prose nearly as much. Awesome, Purple. I'm just taking a second here to glance at your comments there. Fantastic. And again, yeah, if you're following along with the exercises, feel free to share them in the chat. Okay. So, one of the strengths of developing a really good voice is that you can get to the point where, in dialogue especially, a character can speak and you won't necessarily need a dialogue tag or attribution to let the reader know who's speaking, which is great from a flow point of view. It's great for honestly saving words. It's great to manage the pace of your story as well. So when you're thinking about your characters, think about a specific style that colors their speech, right? The formality that they use, their own pacing, slang that they use, a speech pattern that they have. Right? You can tell when I'm excited about something, I'm speaking faster. When I'm less excited about it, as with most people, I'm speaking a little bit slower, or I'm dragging my feet a little bit. I have characters in my novels. One faction of characters only speaks using very formal words. And so they're often offset by more casual characters using contractions and using slang and using, swears. And then a catchphrase, this is an optional one. And sometimes I use it, sometimes I don't. But when you're coming up with a character, you can think of a catchphrase. And I don't mean a catchphrase like, yeah, like a sitcom catchphrase that a character will say once every 3 scenes or something, but something that a character might say more often that only they say. So in my novels, I have an angel and a half demon, and they're best friends. And the half demon casually refers to the angel as choir boy because he's so, stoic. And only she says that. So it's not necessarily catchphrase because she's not going to use it in other conversation, but it's something that only she uses. And so it develops the character just a tiny bit more and it makes readers more attached to them for a very simple thing. Okay. Resist the Nothing asking here, what might be an example of when a core value differs from a core belief? Not sure I get it yet. So there might be a couple ways that you can differentiate this one, but the way that I like to differentiate it is that a value will often inform a belief, or a belief will be shaped by more external forces than a value. So everything in a character is going to be shaped by external things, right? We are all victims or products of our experiences. A value is something that you believe is important and that you kind of hold as a conviction that you want to stick to. A belief is something that you wholeheartedly believe to be true. So you don't believe that courage is true. right? That sentence just doesn't really make sense. But you might believe that courage makes an exemplary person, or you might have a belief in a religious system, for example, whereas a value is more a personal. I don't want to say preference because it's not that casual. But it is something that is more important than that, that you kind of guide yourself by, that's intrinsic to you, even if it's influenced by external things. Rich is doing giving a good point here. Core beliefs can often be irrational. When I'm in a hurry, others should drive faster. I really like that one. I don't know if that's necessarily a core belief, but it's a good example of an irrational belief, right? And I think that's a great way of putting it, where value is generally shorter, and like I keep defaulting to courage. It can be, more than just a one word thing, but a belief is something that you have taken in and processed as the truth. It's not something that is important to you. It's just kind of the way things are to you. Another values are the crust on the pie, beliefs are the pumpkin custard. And I like the metaphor because you have the values surrounding, like they are the base and the walls of your pie, and then the beliefs kind of fill it up, right? I guess you can't have the beliefs without the values, if that makes sense. But you can, again, I want to reinforce that everything kind of comes from somewhere. Your character, if you're trying to make them super believable, which I'm assuming you are because you're here, there are external things that shape both values and beliefs. They are a little more explicit when we think about beliefs. Okay. I'm going to makes Hank very ready for Thanksgiving. Okay. I'm going to introduce this exercise to you. And again, feel free to share it if you want, but consider the traits you've thought about so far and how they can come together to form a voice, at least loosely for now, because we're going to layer so much more stuff onto this. And then think of a line or three that your character might say and pay attention to how those traits inform that voice. And then afterwards, highlight the words, passages, or tone that was influenced by those traits. I'm just going to take one moment here. Resist to nothing. I appreciate the question. And thank you, Richard and Purple, for contributing to that too. Again, remember, this is a collaborative environment. And while I like to think I have a lot of answers because I have the privilege of doing this for a living, there is, again, so much more experience out there that I like to lean on. And we're going to talk about, the biggest belief soon. I'm getting so excited. But let's talk about a very important trait or set of traits next, and that is character flaws. These are imperfections, weaknesses, or negative traits that make your character both more human and relatable, but also gives you an opportunity to, quite honestly, exploit them. They can pop up in a bunch of places throughout your story where you can leverage them the most. The internal conflict that your character will experience is the result of a flaw. Right? There is something that is kind of lacking in them, and they must confront that and overcome it or succumb to it in order for their internal conflict to be resolved. And flaws give us those things to create obstacles with. If your character has some kind of limitation or fear or what have you, you as the author can cherry pick that and create obstacles as a result. The flaws are quite important to understand because of what I call Superman syndrome, and I don't want to, offend any DC comic fans out here, but the traditional mainstream depiction of Superman, because I know it's more nuanced in the comics, is that he's just this perfect human being, right? A chiseled jawline, muscular, only like flies super strong, laser eyes, gets the girl, everything's right, right? Now, if there wasn't kryptonite in that to create some kind of weakness, he would be a very boring person. And even with kryptonite, he runs the risk of being a very boring character because the from that very basic definition, there are no flaws in him. He is morally upstanding. He always does the right thing, and he is capable of always doing the right thing because he is better than everyone else. It's kind of like the paladin example I gave a little bit ago from Honor Among Thieves. But that's a caricature of the perfect Superman. So without flaws, you run the risk of writing that really boring character. Now, writers over the years have made Superman flawed, have given him the weakness of kryptonite, and have exploited those flaws. Even things like, traditionally he has his love interest Lois Lane, and villains can exploit that weakness or that flaw in him, that he either has to save her or save a bus full of children or whatever the story might be. I got real dark there. But you get what I'm saying. Without that thing to exploit, it's tough to have a good character. Now we break flaws up into 3 different levels of bad. We have the minor flaws, which is a negative trait that differentiates them from others, but usually isn't a major part of the sorry. Right. Got me. Minor flaws don't usually affect the plot or a character's arc. They are little hindrances, or they separate them from the rest of the cast the way any other trait would. We get a little worse than that. We have major flaws. They truly affect a character, and it's either mentally, physically, or emotionally standing in their way. These are the ones that we take and we make obstacles out of. This could be anything from an obsession over something to anxiety over something. Major flaws, despite the verbiage, flaws can include physical or developmental disabilities. That's not to say that anyone with a disability is flawed, but by definition, a flaw in writing presents an obstacle for the character. If you choose to use that as a flaw for a character, I suggest you get a sensitivity reader. I suggest you do your homework if you're not part of that community to make sure you truly understand it and you're not just using it as a cheap way to make your character's life harder. And then we have the fatal flaw, which is a flaw that not a lot of authors will end up using because it's usually saved for tragedies, but not always. But as the name implies, this is a flaw that leads to some sort of demise, usually actual demise. This is a flaw that can lead to death. Okay, for our purposes, I want you to focus on minor and major flaws. You can come up with a fatal flaw. I It really depends on your story, and the majority of stories don't have a fatal flaw for a character, but they do have pretty impactful major flaws. So, as you're developing your own character, think of 1 to 3 minor flaws that set them apart, but don't necessarily impact the story. So they might, I have a terrible problem with picking at my nails. That's a minor flaw, right? You can use that in a story to differentiate me in a room because I might be picking at my nails and bothering everybody else, but that's probably not going to come up in the plot. Then I want you to think of a major flaw that will be a problem for this character down the road. Think about what that flaw is, and then think about how you're going to use that to present an obstacle. Purple, I had a history prof in college who made a point of contrasting history and history, capitalize, and truth with truth. I don't know if I'm fully following you there, but feel free to elaborate for me. Okay, now we're starting to move into the best stuff, in my opinion. I mean, it's all good, and we're here for another little bit still, but I have made it my personal mission to convince people how important character backstory is. Everything in backstory, or backstory is inclusive of everything from their history to their experiences to their relationships. It's everything that comes before the story starts, right? Everything that's happened to them, and it influences everything else. Now, a lot of things that we've already spoken about, flaws, values, beliefs, and their voice as well. That's kind of encompassing in backstory or is the result of backstory. But I really want to focus on backstory itself, because from backstory, we can pull things like character motivation. Their backstory influences how they act, why they act that way, and the decisions that they make throughout your novel. It provides some emotional depth as well. They aren't just this character that sprang to life on page 1. That will read very shallow, even if you put in a lot of extra effort. And backstory can be an excellent source of conflict as well. There are so many things you can pull from there, even if it's not the primary external or internal conflict in your novel. You can pull things like, say they had a awful sibling relationship or a great sibling relationship. You can use that throughout your story in interesting ways. Backstory equals prequels. Well, Jane, my 60-day novel that I'm writing is a prequel based on a character's backstory. So you got me there. I can't dispute that. But something that I don't have in here that is something to keep in mind as well is that a character's backstory is a great source for stuff like prequels, or it's a great source for bonus content. Say you're building your author email list and you want to create this extra content for them or share something with your audience. A backstory is a great place to pull that information from. You can write a short story or create a character profile that you share with them that details a little bit of that. Great bonus content source. Alicia sharing here that Nox, her character, is a perfectionist and everything is more or less his way or the highway. I can see how that could go wrong. Hank, everything can be a prequel if you're writing a time traveler. Thanks, Hank. Hank's lucky he's not on screen with me here because then we'd be more antagonistic. Okay, so when you're thinking about your backstory, there are a couple key events that I want you to keep in mind. And these are the things that really create the character that we see or that you're going to be writing. So they're formative experiences. These are the things that shape those core beliefs, fears, or desires, whether they consciously know that this thing happened or that this thing had that effect or not. So when a character falls, say they fall down a well, that might instill them with a fear of heights, and they might know that, but they might not realize that they blame their friend who didn't catch them, and that's why they have trust issues. That's a formative experience that's kind of double-sided there, rooting from the same thing, both subconsciously and unconsciously, or sorry, consciously and unconsciously aware of what resulted from that. Realize I use subconsciously and unconsciously synonymously. Don't pick on me. Turning points in their life. So major life events that altered the path that they were on. So they could have been going in one direction and their life just took a 90-degree turn or a 180 or whatever degree you want due to something like a death, a big decision, a promotion at work, an encounter with a particular individual. Like, what are those big events that kind of shot them in a different direction that ended them up here? And then what we call emotional scars, as unresolved trauma or issues that still affect them. Again, I write really dark stories. I love dark fantasy. I love horror. So I, as respectfully as I can, and I think this is important for anyone writing with trauma, I love using past trauma to make characters more deep and give them more things to overcome. And when I say I write dark stuff like dark fantasy, I write it because it makes the outcome brighter. Right? That's the reason I do it. So if you are going to lean into trauma a lot, and we're going to talk about one particularly traumatic thing for your character in a moment, make sure you're approaching it with respect and dignity, especially if it is like a real trauma that happens to real people. Um, but that, I think that's a conversation for another day. But that is something to keep in mind when you're using trauma. Richard wrote a whole second novel from a character's backstory. It's great. If you take the time to develop backstory, it is such a juicy place to get stuff from. Okay. So part of backstory are relationships. Relationships we have split up into two parts. Again, the before the novel and during the novel parts. Relationships for a character play an integral role in the formative experiences they have and the values that they have, the beliefs that they have, the flaws that they have even. You see how everything's kind of starting to layer together here and get all squished, that we're piecing it apart, but it is almost impossible to create some kind of perfect linear path to follow because it will be unique to your own uh, experience or your own way that you want to put this together. So these are all the different elements that you can take in. But relationships you can think of from a backstory perspective, parental influence, and a lot of our beliefs, values, and self worth are derived from there. sibling relationships like rivalries, best friends, influences in other ways, and then extended relatives in whatever role they may play. There are also key relationships outside of familial relationships you want to think of. Significant figures who guided or influenced their development, like mentors, friends, romances, heartbreaks, rivals, mortal enemies, like myself and Hank. So these, you don't need to list every single one of these. Okay? And I think if you did, it would get a little too muddy. It would get a little too crammed in your character's backstory. But if you pick one or two and you really dive into them, you can three or four if you want. But if you're writing for the 60-day novel challenge, you don't want to go too heavy into it because you won't have a lot of room in your 50,000 words to explore a lot of that backstory. If you do want to go farther than that, if you wanted, three or four relationships for your protagonist for this challenge, go for it. I'm not going to stop you, but just bear in mind we're on a timeline here when it comes to this challenge. But pick a handful of them, pick a couple of them, and really dive into what these relationships have done to your character. They don't need to be negative. I keep harping on flaws and trauma and stuff like that. They don't need to be bad relationships. There can be very important positive relationships, especially like mentorships, romances, friendships that make your character who they are today. Okay. Also in their backstory is society and culture. This is where the person has lived or grown up or was born and the impact that that has had on who they are. So, from a social status point of view, how has wealth or poverty influenced their opportunities and outlook? Are they able to move within those social classes? Have they been restricted to one social class for their entire life? What are the ramifications of that? How has that influenced what they believe or what they value? Their culture itself. So, what values or behavior has been shaped by that culture? How has the historical events from that culture influenced them? And this is true in real life writing. This is true if you're writing fantasy or sci-fi. You're developing these well lived worlds, and part of that is culture, and part of culture is history, and all of that influences a character. And then you can also talk about their geography. We just did a world building workshop for Dabble Premium, and we went really hard into how everything in your world affects the rest of your world, and part of that world is your characters. So even if your character grew up in the mountains, going to be living a lot differently and look at life a lot differently than someone who grew up in a city. If they grew up on the coast, it's going to look a lot different than someone who lives in the prairies. Geography affects who they are and what they believe and what they can do. Ray saying here, as someone who's fascinated by psychology, this discussion is the culmination of what I want to think about all day long. Fantastic. It's really interesting stuff. Like it, and this is why I get so caught up in explaining backstory because there's so many moving pieces to it. And when you really think about your character as a living, breathing person or orc or alien or whomever they may be, you think about all these things that go into an actual person and all the potential you have to make them feel real. I had uh, I worked with a writing coach last year to further flesh out the backstory of my protagonist that I thought I knew, but he forced me to go deeper than I ever thought I needed to, and it has completely revolutionized how I think about my character. So that's why I'm so passionate about it because it's really changed how I view my own writing. Yep. But again, the good stuff too. And I know you talk about positive stuff in therapy as well, but I think there's this preconception that you only talk about the negative. But yes, but I think the juicier stuff, the stuff that makes it into the book or has the biggest impact in the book, tends to be negative when we're coming up with the characters, which is fine. Again, that's right up my alley. Now we're getting to the magnum opus, the best part about backstory. That's what I've called the big hurt and the lie. So these are two of the most important elements of your character's backstory and your character themselves. The big hurt is what I call it because I like to be a little goofy. I don't know. But it's also known as the ghost or the shard of glass. And it is a moment in their past that is the biggest and often most painful thing they've ever experienced. Even if they don't know it, it haunts them to this very day. And it leads to the creation of the lie. The lie, or the lie that your character believes, or the wound, is this flawed philosophy your character believes to be true. It affects everything they do and believe, and it needs to be tested at some point throughout the story if you're giving your character this big, juicy thing. This really will change the way you think about characters if you haven't thought about them from this perspective before. If you give them this traumatic thing, it informs this core belief of how they view the world, and that belief is incorrect. So it might be a classic example is someone who had their heart broken, like in a rom-com or something before the story started, doesn't believe in love anymore. This is I don't want to see it's cliche, it's more tropey. And so throughout the story, that lie is tested and they will eventually need to confront it and then live happily ever after when they realize that they've been lying to themselves. But you can take this and you can apply it to any genre and any character. And when you do, you start coming up with a lot more ways to test your character and make their life more difficult in your story. So, with the big hurt and the lie come two other elements, the need and the truth. The need is what your character has to experience in order to face the big hurt and ultimately confront their lie. This is going to be something that is in your story, but I've included it here because it is so intrinsically connected to these elements. And the truth is what they're trying to hide themselves from, what their brain has said, hey, we experienced this thing. And as a result, I'm ignoring this truth and we believe the lie to be true. Now, in a character arc, if they have this big hurt and this lie informing them, then they are going to experience their need and they're going to face the truth. In a positive character arc, which is the vast majority of arcs, they will experience this need and then accept the new truth to be true, which sounds silly, but that's just the way it's phrased. They will accept the truth as in place of the lie, and they will reject the lie that they've believed for most, if not all, of their life. In a negative arc, the truth is too painful for them, or it is too inconvenient, or they are not happy with the person they will become if they embrace the truth and they choose to reject it. And they embrace their lie, they double down on it, and people suffer as a result. Negative arcs end sadly, right? But these are the kind of four core elements to really gripping character development. So I'm just going to hop back here again. The big hurt is that really traumatic moment in their past. Not every character is going to have a super traumatic moment. And not even every protagonist will have a super traumatic moment. I can't tell you that your main character has to have experienced trauma and has to have this lie so they face the need and embrace or reject the truth. However, you can write really, really strong characters if you embrace these things. So the big hurt is that moment, and the lie is a misinformed belief that they accept to be true, and that guides them throughout most of your story. So I'm so passionate about this. So this is something that we will touch on a couple times throughout this workshop as well, because it does inform a whole lot of other stuff. But for now, I want you to come up with a big hurt and a lie that results from it for your character. So, what's something that could have happened to your character that is so painful they need to come up with a lie just to cope with the real world? Because remember, this event has to be so big and life changing that they wholeheartedly embrace this lie and they truly don't believe that anything else is true. This is how they live their life. Like, this is their guiding light, and nothing kind of makes that waver until they're tested again and again throughout their arc and throughout your story. And then we get to the need and the truth. So then what lie do they cement as truth because of this event? Okay. I think I missed a message here too. Uh, oh yeah, I wanted to point this one out. Jane saying here, as I'm developing my novel, I'm wondering if I should write the prequel first. Do it. I mean, I can't tell you not to, but I also found I considered doing this before, but I found when I wrote not the prequel, it gave me more insight into what I wanted the prequel to be, right? And that might not be the case for you, but I think writing the prequel that I am now wouldn't I don't know if I would have done it as effectively as it's turning out if I had done it first. because I got to know the character and how things ended up, and now I can more effectively backfill there. Ray, I would share my answers for the big hurt and the lie, but I write stories just as dark as yours. Fantastic. Well, you can share it in the cafe and just put a little disclaimer at the top saying that it's dark or something. But or if you don't want to, don't. Right? There are things partially because I'm representative of Dabble in my activity at the cafe, but also just because I know some people don't want to read that stuff. I won't include a lot of the darker stuff, but you can include a disclaimer if you want people to see it. I'm just going to linger here for a second. Alicia, my character doesn't really know his big hurt, which is the case for most people. But he was made an orphan, and the way he was raised informed his lie, which is it's not okay to waste time on fun when there are important things to be done. Which honestly is a little too real for me. A little too real life, Alicia. I think a lot of people suffer from that. But there's something I want to point out there that I just kind of glazed over. Your character won't realize that the big hurt is so impactful and so life changing. So if we go back to that well analogy that I gave, the character might think that the ramifications of falling down the well is the fear of heights, but really the lie is that others can't be trusted, but they don't even know that, right? They're not aware of that. I just kind of made that example off the top of my head, 15 minutes ago. So it should be more fleshed out than that. But if a character knows that the big hurt happens and they know the lie they made as a result, then it's harder for them to stick to that lie and to believe it to be true. Is generally they experience this and they aren't even aware that the ramifications are what they are, the consequences are what they are. Janet, you're making me feel too good. I wish I had this workshop before I'd written my book. Well, you have it before you write your next book. Remind me, I'm actually going to start that because there's something I want to mention about developing as a writer, but it's not super relevant to this workshop right now, so we'll save it till the end. Okay. Now we want to talk about their motivation. Motivation is the combination of forces that drive a character's actions and decisions. We need motivation to be in place in order to make your character's actions make sense. And a lot of stuff, again, we're talking about this layering or this coming together of all these elements. A lot of the stuff that we've spoken about is now starting to come together to form these other things. Right? The values, beliefs, the big hurt and the lie, the flaws, all these different traits come together to help inform motivation. So there are a bunch of types of motivation, and I've broken them down into different dichotomies here. So we have internal motivation, which is driven by personal desires, emotions, or needs. So a need for acceptance, a desire for revenge, a fear of failure. Then there's external motivations, which is when another character or a circumstance outside of the character is pushing them forward. So a physical threat, societal expectations, those kinds of things. You can see even here how societal expectations can be an external motivator, but it can also shape a value to want to fit in, which is then an internal motivation. And not all motivations are created equal. So internal and external motivations can have equal significance to your character or even perceived significance. But for our purposes as authors, we have a primary motivation, which is what's fueling their overarching goal or desire, and secondary motivation, which is more immediate. It is something that might change throughout the story. It is something that might just be specific for a scene, and we'll talk about how goals are created in a moment here. But these aren't on the same level. Your primary motivation is what you're really thinking about before you start writing, so that your character's actions make sense. Your secondary motivation is more scene by scene, or chapter by chapter, or part by part, act by act, however you want to break it up. It's smaller in scale. Then the other one we have here, which is sort of or similar to those last two, is a surface motivation, which is what they believe they want or need, and so it tends to be more immediate. And then a deep motivation, which is the underlying emotional or psychological need, which is often tied to their core values, the big hurt or the lie that they believe. So the deep motivation normally fuels the primary motivation here, or is, part of it, part and parcel. The surface motivation tends to be a little more superficial, might be tied to an external conflict rather than an internal one, and tends to be resolved a little more quickly. You also might have a surface motivation that they believe to be their deep motivation, and that helps them through it and is tied to the lie, but they realize that's not the case later on in the book. Tell you stop. Doug's amazing workshops are responsible for a few edits I wasn't anticipating. Thank you, TW. I really appreciate that. Allows me to shamelessly plug Dabble Premium, in which we do a workshop like this every month. This month we will be doing a magic, building your own magic system. That's kind of a part two to our world building. We will also have, I'll announce this now, and there will be probably an official announcement later, but as part of the 60-day challenge and as part of NaNoWriMo, if you're participating in NaNoWriMo, we will have a workshop at the start of November about how to finish a book in 30 days, about how to actually do the writing in 30 days. So with a 60-day challenge, we're doing the planning part and we're doing all the events throughout November, like weekly events still. But we're going to do a shorter workshop than this one's going to be, about more tangible things that are quite honestly a lot like week 4 in the challenge. But if you want them fleshed out a little bit more in this format, then look for a notification soon. If you're subscribed or part of the challenge community, I will put it over in the cafe. Okay, so when you're writing, here are some ways to use a character's motivation. Obviously, it drives their decisions. It is what makes them do the things that they do, or that they think makes them do the things they do. It's a great place to come up with conflicts. When there's opposing motivations, you have people going head to head, and that creates conflicts. It's a good way to show growth or corruption in an arc when motivation changes. When they decide, hey, the reason I'm doing this isn't the same as before, that indicates or shows the reader, or indicates to or shows the reader that something has changed within them as a result of what they've been reading so far. And a powerful climax tests motivation as well. We're going to talk about climax in a little bit. Okay, and then for an exercise here, think about your character's backstory, ideally the big hurt and lie that resulted from it, then identify a deep internal motivation that would result from this past. Again, when we look at it, uh, internal motivation, so driven by personal desires, emotions, or needs. And then deep is the underlying emotional or psychological need. Cool. Let me take a sip while I think of an answer to Purple's question here. Okay, Purple. This is a great question for this. What if you haven't figured out what the big hurt or the lie is? I kind of know and I kind of don't. So, especially this early in the challenge or this early in conceptualizing a story in general, this is perfectly okay. And this is why we're brainstorming things. And hopefully what you'll get, because you're doing the exercises here, and hopefully you kind of flesh them out, and we'll talk about more stuff on Thursday during the challenge live stream. You'll start generating more ideas. You don't need to come up with the big hurt and the lie first. You can, and I think it's a really powerful way to fuel other parts of a character. But I've created a lot of characters where I've thought of other things, sometimes really superficial things like tattoos or eye color or magical talent or something like that, and then worked backwards towards it. So the fact that you even have an inkling of an idea right now means that you just need to start fleshing out other areas, maybe not just of your character, but of the plot as well. And then you can kind of circle back and keep adding to it until you have something that you like. And then it might be, more work once you flesh it out. You have to go and refine other things. That's just writing life. That's just the way it is. But yeah, don't stress if you haven't got there yet. Get inspired from the rest of this workshop. Get inspired from the challenge. Ask for feedback in the community, but don't worry yet, because it will come. You will get there. And Ray, putting voice to my thoughts here. We appreciate you being so willing to voice your questions, Purple. Yeah, and it does. I'm glad it makes Ray more comfortable voicing theirs, and hopefully makes other people more comfortable voicing theirs as well. My better half is a self-admitted question asker. Whenever she has a staff meeting, when they finish at the end, hey, does anyone have questions? Everyone looks at her, right? So I appreciate a good question asker. Okay, So, from motivation, we get goals. Goals are specific objectives or outcomes the character actively pursues throughout the story. They provide directions for both the character and the plot. We have two different kinds of goals here in terms of how long they take. We have short term goals, they're immediate objectives that drive individual scenes or chapters. Think of finding a lost item, winning a battle, chasing after the person, getting on their plane. Then we have long term goals, which are overarching objectives that span the entire story. And the goal themselves, like even a long-term goal might flux a little bit, might change direction to adapt to and conflict that you throw at your character. But I'm going to jump back a couple slides here. Remember, short-term, long-term goals, we think about things like primary motivation and secondary motivation. Your secondary motivation is the smaller, often more immediate one. Those are going to be tied to your short-term goals. Your primary motivation, your deeper motivation, is going to be tied to the long-term goals. So every goal needs to have some kind of motivation behind it. I don't use the bolded, italicized must lightly. If your character doesn't have a reason to pursue their goal, why would readers believe that that goal is important? Why would they care? Why are there stakes? Why are they even reading this story in the first place? The larger the goal, the deeper and more internalized the motivation. Like I said, some motivations and goals are seen like that, simply survival in one thing, or chasing someone down, or you forgot to give someone, like the delivery person, the tip, and so you run after them to prove that you're a good person. Maybe a short-term goal. I'm just kind of spewing that kind of stuff, but that that's something to keep in mind. The larger the goal, the more you need to think about where this motivation comes from and why it's important to the character. The big hurt, so flawed beliefs, aka the lie, might lead to misguided goals or hurt a character's progress to the deeper goals they need. This is where we start being the cruel authors that we are and playing with our characters' emotions and needs. Right? They might think that they have a long-term goal rooted in very deep motivation, but that motivation is actually informed by the lie, and we know that the lie is not true, right? Ugh, it's the name, but we know that it's an internalized mistruth that they have convinced themselves is true. So you can use that to mess with the character to help them with their arc and for that realization at the end, or if you're writing a negative arc, for that corruption or fall at the end. We really, the whole point of a story, and forgive me if you've been to an event before because you've heard this a million times from my mouth. A story without conflict is a textbook. That's, if I had a catchphrase, that's probably one of them. The entire point of writing the story is to test the characters, to force them to change. And that's what makes it entertaining for the reader. If we don't provide obstacles in between where the character is and where they want to be, it's going to be a really boring story. We can break the obstacles down into a couple different ways. So you have the internal obstacles, informed by their fears, doubts, or flaws that stop them from pursuing their goals. Then you have the external obstacles, which are physical challenges. Though they might be emotional or mental challenges as well, but they're from external sources, right? They come from the environment or other characters, especially the antagonist. The antagonist, by definition, wants the opposite of what the character wants. Their goals are conflicting with one another. But you also have, like, here, the environment itself, and that can be nature, or that can be a city, that can be construction, that can be traffic, that can be what have you. Those things can provide obstacles in between a character and their goals as well. However, even saying those things out loud, a lot of them feel shallow, right? Traffic is not going to be a great obstacle for a long term goal, because a long term goal is tied to a deep motivation, which is a lot more meaningful to a character. And then the pursuit of goals often generates conflict in a character with others or with their environment. And I already mentioned that, especially with the antagonists, they are in direct opposition to one another. There is somebody who asked in the cafe about the romance genre and the love interest being the antagonist. And so I say here that conflict often generates because the antagonist and protagonist are butting heads, right? But in some cases, the antagonist isn't even aware that they're an antagonist. So in romance, for the most part, the love interest is the antagonist because they do something that creates conflict and that leads to that a temporary breakup before the happily ever after or the happy for now. Uh, they are unaware of that, but when you're planning these characters out, you need to keep this in mind that the love interest has to have a goal that is contrary to the protagonist. And the protagonist goal is usually rooted in that trauma from the past. So even though it's a separate character, you need to think about how this character's goal, the antagonist's goal, ties into things like the big hurt and the lie. Okay, here's your exercise for motivation if you want to do it. Outline one short term or long term goal, or both if you're feeling up to it. Connect to the motivation you developed in the previous exercise. Bonus points if you think of a way their lie skews their goal. Bear with me for one moment here while I read this question. Ray's asking, do you have any advice on how to deepen motivation slash goals that you already have established? For context, I'm struggling with my antagonist being more compelling than my protagonist. I think I'm gonna bank that to the end, Ray, and I'm gonna ask you for a little bit more context because is the struggle that your antagonist is more when you say more compelling, like they're more interesting to read about than your protagonist, and you don't want them to overshadow the protagonist? Or is it something else? Did I misinterpret that? But we'll visit that at the end because I think it's a little bit of a longer conversation. Okay, now we're moving into the next part three of the workshop, part two of that dichotomy that I presented earlier, but this is during the story. So again, with development, you have where you're coming from, you have where you end up, and all the stuff in between. We've covered where you're coming from. All of the things that we just spoke about are things that you can create and map out before you start writing. There's a lot that can go into a character. Now we're moving into the stuff that draws from that and changes some of that and is influenced by that until we get to the end. And that's during the story. Okay, let's talk about character arcs. I wittingly said, or wittingly, wittily, I don't know. I cleverly said the journey and the destination. I'm much better at writing than I am at improving jokes. So character arcs are the internal journeys fictional people undergo, usually resulting in transformation. We break them down into these three categories: positive arc, which is where the character grows, learns, or becomes a better version of themselves. Oppositely, the negative arc, which is where they fall, become corrupted, and it's often due to their flaws or external pressures and embracing that lie that they've believed this whole time. There's the flat arc, which is where the character largely remains the same but affects the world or other characters around them. I like to give, well, within the flat arc is also the transformational arc. You might hear them separate. So a flat arc can be absolutely no change and they just experience the story. A transformational arc is also flat in that they don't become better or worse, but who they are as a character changes. And so to help differentiate that, a flat arc is like Indiana Jones where he goes after the treasure, he flings his whip around, he punches and he kicks, and then he gets out with the treasure. That's it. His character doesn't really change. James Bond, same kind of way. Those like serial hero stories tend to be flat arcs. Transformational arcs, I like to give the example of Katniss from Hunger Games. Morally, she does not become that different. She kind of has her morals at the beginning. They are largely the same at the end, but she goes from being a woman in District 12, maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, to the leader of a revolution, right? Very different roles, but the same kind of character. Even if she's tested throughout and her goals and motivations might change, who she is largely stays the same. Okay. Now, my pal Abby, who's another writer here at Dabble, came up with these 9 steps to making a character arc memorable, and we're gonna go through them here. TW confirmed, yes, District 12 for me. Thank you. So, when you're crafting an arc, here's kind of the main beats to it, and you'll probably notice if you've been reading some of the 60-day stuff that this is quite similar. Like it can mirror a plot because a protagonist arc is tied to the plot itself, right? It's their story that they're experiencing. But you can also take this and condense it down for a secondary character that doesn't take up the entire book. It can be an important secondary character that experiences change throughout the whole thing, but you can also condense secondary character arcs into, an act. So everything's normal. That's just It's who they are. They're living their life. Normal doesn't necessarily mean boring. Normal can be scavenging in a post-apocalyptic world, but it's what they're used to. Then we have the bye bye normal or your inciting incident. Things change and they're forced away from where they were before. They're going to take some time to cling to the past because no human being, or again, orc, elf, alien, whatever, no person wants to leave their ordinary because they are comfortable there. They feel more or less safe there. They're used to it. And change, even if they embrace change, change can be scary and change presents a threat. Then a bunch of new stuff happens to them. This is where we would, go into the rising action in a traditional story structure. This is where their values and beliefs are tested. This is where they grow. This is where they try new things and they fail, but they adapt as a result. Then once they start getting their feet underneath them and adapting to this new world, you pull the rug out from under them, make them fall flat on their face so they realize, hey, I'm not comfortable in this new place just yet. I still have some more growth or learning to do. This gives them an opportunity to be bold. And if we're looking at a 3 act structure, the pulling the rug out is usually the midpoint. Time to be bold means that they're now going into the end of the second act. They have decided they are not just going to be reactive anymore, they're going to be proactive. This might mean that their goal changes slightly or their motivation changes slightly, and they orient themselves in a new direction. And not even slightly, their goal might change dramatically. They might realize they were pursuing the wrong goal and change. But there's this mindset shift where they aren't just letting stuff happen to them, they are now pushing themselves forward. Then they encounter the biggest failure yet. This is important because it gives us the opportunity to present the need, right? We had the big hurt, the lie, then the need and the ultimate truth. So when they go in this new direction, it might sound like, hey, maybe they've rejected the lie, but they haven't. They are just orienting themselves and they're kind of embracing everything they've learned, meshing it with the lie that they believe and pushing forward. Then we make them fail again, and this is usually the pre-climax of a novel. They have to commit to a change in order to overcome this biggest failure. If they so in a positive arc, this is when they are presented with the need, they embrace the truth and reject the lie, and they can overcome that challenge. In a negative arc, they have the need, they're presented with the truth, they reject it, they double down, and they either fail or they overcome because they double down on their lie. And then there are generally negative ramifications as a result, if not for them, then the people around them. And then at the end of that, the new normal. I like visualizing this almost like a hero's journey cycle, right? They go through their journey, they change, and then they don't necessarily come back to where they were. They don't need to go back to the Shire, but their life is now different, but they've adapted to it. They've now come to this new ordinary world, but they are different. Okay, here's uh, an exercise that I really, really like, and I like it so much I've included it in the 60-day challenge. For a character, I want you to come up with a 4 sentence summary for their arc. And those 4 sentences are who they are. So, how would you describe your character at the start of your story? Consider their lie and upcoming transformation. What pushes them to get out of their normal and get all messed up? What's the biggest obstacle they face tied to their lie? So, this is going to their biggest failure yet, right? This is the obstacle that they will fail and then need to embrace the truth to overcome. What is that challenge? And then who are they at the end of the story once they've either grown or fallen? Or if you're writing a flat arc, if you're writing a flat arc, generally there isn't a lie to be confronted. There might be this major flaw that skews who they are as a person or makes them more interesting, but they don't really have that super traumatic past for you to play with because they're not changing, right? They don't need to confront it. So this is best for a positive or negative arc. And again, most stories use a positive arc. Okay, we have purple here. Not a 4 sentence summary, but Sauron wants the ring so he can rule them all. Frodo and Co want the ring to keep it away from Sauron and the journey itself. Yeah, those are opposing goals. Resist to nothing. It seems that these 9 steps will work very well with the hero's journey. Yep, absolutely. Thinking about how these steps will be fleshed in a fast-paced thriller, say with a Fichtean plot structure. Okay, let's resist. I hope you're hanging around to the end because I am going to save that to the end as well. Um, because I do want to be a little cognizant of time. I want to make sure that we can get through the content before the 2 hour mark, and then if the Q&A takes us after 4 o'clock Eastern, then I'm okay with that. I hope everyone else is okay with that. But that can be a little bit of a discussion. Okay, within character arcs and the source of a lot of change in our novels is conflict. I love conflict. It is what makes stories exciting, right? I don't need to reiterate my textbook comment. We divide conflict into two different types: external and internal. I'm going to look at external first. These are any challenges or obstacles outside the character that manifest as a physical, societal, or situational conflict. Uh, External conflicts are great as plot vehicles. Without an external conflict, there is nothing really to push your character outside of their ordinary world or their normal. Right? There is something that forces their hand, and it is not their internal conflict because they're pretty content living with their lie right now. No one chooses to go and change, right? Something is driving them, and the internal will come as a result, but we need that external to push them. And then you use external conflict to directly oppose a character's goal. That means that your character is going to go through these try fail cycles. It means that they're going to fall on their face, they're going to have to adapt or learn new skills, or they might overcome some of them, and they make their way towards the ultimate goal. External conflict is also what I call the sexy conflict. It's the one that the story is about. Because I write fantasy, I think about things like the necromancer is amassing an undead army, or there's a rebellion in the neighboring kingdom that's spilling over the border. Those big conflicts that are what the story is about is external, right? But it's the internal conflicts that we'll learn in a moment here that really makes a story memorable and makes it meaningful. But they work together. So there are six, or yeah, six kinds of external conflict. Got confused because I had a little six up there next to conflict too. So character versus character. This is pretty straightforward to understand, especially when you're thinking from a protagonist and antagonist perspective. This is when two characters conflict. They have opposing goals, they get in each other's way, they try to stop one another. Now character versus character can also happen inadvertently. Again, think back to romance, where the antagonist, the love interest, it might not even be aware that they're slowing or interrupting the goals of the main character. That's still character versus character conflict. You have character versus society. This is where you have societal pressures or expectations weighing down on a character and they have to deal with that. Character versus nature. Nature itself is trying to oppose you. You know, landslides, snowstorms, tornadoes, that kind of stuff. But it could also be wolves. I think there was like a Liam Neeson movie a handful of years ago where he got stranded in Alaska, I think, and wolves were chasing it. That's character versus nature. Character versus technology is just as it sounds, the character is up against technology itself. That could be in the form of something like robots or androids where they're more sentient or acting, but it could also be technology like social media if a character is feeling pressure from there or resistance from there, or any number of tech firms out there that are, selling your data or what have you. However you want to frame the story, they're going up against either sentient technology or kind of systemic technology. The supernatural is kind of like a blend of nature and character, but this is when they're facing something that is more than nature. And generally, when you're writing something like cosmic horror or a lot of horror in general, the thing that they are up against, a supernatural entity, is stronger than them. It is more overwhelming than them. It's unknown to a degree. And that provides a lot of different room to play with. And then character versus fate or destiny. You can differentiate these ones a little bit, but I kind of lump them together in that there is something that it seems like the universe has planned for this character, and they do not want that. And so they're trying to change their destiny. Up to you whether they're successful or not, which I guess is the case with all conflict, but this is more a thematic one. I go through so much water in these workshops. Okay, then we have internal conflict. And you might be thinking, wow, there's a lot of things on the in this external conflict page that can be used for internal conflict. And we'll get to that because they are, again, tied together so tightly. But we need to differentiate them because they serve different purposes. So, the psychological, emotional, or moral struggles in a character's heart or mind is the internal conflict that they're facing. It is more or less always directly linked to their arcs. Right? Their arc is kind of this journey to resolve this conflict that they are experiencing inside. And that's why it's a great character developer. While external conflict can present a challenge, internal conflict is more about who they are. And it's usually the external conflict that is a challenge because of this internal conflict that they're facing. Internal conflict is also a great way for you to explore themes or develop themes. And generally, we're not going to talk about themes in this workshop. We will talk about them in week 4 of the challenge. But this is a great way to show, like, if your theme is friendship conquers all, then the internal conflict of I don't need friends or I'm better off alone, resolved through a character arc to realize that theme is true, is a great way to use these things all together. Okay, and we have a handful of internal conflicts here. 5, I think, on the list. We have a moral conflict. This is where your character believes something should be one way, like it's important to them. It's informed by their values and beliefs, but that is tested, right? They try to be good, but maybe being good isn't good enough for the situation. Identity conflict. This is more like who they are in the world, less about another kind of conflict that we'll talk about, self-esteem, in a second. But this is where do they belong? What are they going to do with their lives? Trying to figure out who they are and what their place is. Religious or philosophical conflict, very similar to cultural conflict, but this is more entrenched into the individual and kind of basing their own worth or values based on or against the values they think they should be having, right? So less the religion or philosophy imposing itself on them and more them reflecting off of those institutions or thoughts. Self-esteem conflict, very similar to identity conflict, but this is more, am I good enough? Am I going to have the skills to do something, and less like, where do I belong? So they might know where they belong. The identity conflict might be resolved or never exist, but then they question whether they are good enough to rise to the occasion, which is very common and very easy to tie to external conflicts. And then we have relationship conflict, which again, we need to internalize this more than it might initially sound. So rather than conflict caused by a relationship by another character, this is more their own role in a relationship. Am I worthy of this relationship? Uh, do I deserve love or affection or whatever relationship word you want to put in there? Okay. Now, I just want to do a quick kind of comparison here to show you first what these conflicts might look like in a story, and then what they're used for. So, external conflict, it's visible, it's external, it's not happening within the character, so we can actually see it or at least see the cause of it. Often involves direct confrontation, battles, arguments, chases, what have you, and it's plot driven. It moves or it helps drive the plot, moves the story forward through actions and events, and forces the character to grow. Internal conflict, on the other hand, is invisible. It's psychological. It's inside of their head. So it may be influenced by external factors, but ultimately it is a character kind of battling themselves. It involves introspection and emotional tension, like internal debates and moral questioning, and it deepens the story by exploring the character's morals and values. Now, what are we using them for? External conflict is great for suspense and excitement. It's great for testing the character's abilities and resilience. It provides them with opportunities to change. And this is probably the most important one from a character development standpoint. Because again, human people, characters are there. There's a lot of friction in people. We do not want to change. Change is difficult. Change means being uncomfortable. External conflict helps drive that change because we don't really have a choice. And then it can also drive the plot, keep readers engaged. It's exciting. Again, it's the sexy conflict. It's the I love sword fights. I've said that already. I have a friend that doesn't like sword fights, but she still reads fantasy. I don't know what's up with that, but a lot of people love these kinds of conflicts because they're flashy and they're fun. Internal conflict adds emotional depth and complexity. It drives character development and growth. It explores themes and moral questions, and it makes the plot more meaningful. As much as I hate to admit it, a story just about a medieval war with magic flinging everywhere. It's fun, but it is not a meaningful story, right? It does not have depth to it. It will not last with readers unless you do a particularly cool magic scene or something, and even that is a fleeting memory. We use internal conflict to make things more impactful and make our stories more memorable and meaningful. Okay, so we're yes. Okay. So I want to talk about how these two intersect with one another. Um, First, I want you to identify the external conflict in your story, right? How it is tied to goals. Here's your exercise. Then the internal conflict that your character faces, and how does it reflect their backstory, specifically their big hurt and their lie. Then I need you to think about how they intersect, because we're gonna get to a part when we talk about the climax where these things do intersect, but ultimately, the most compelling conflicts, especially external conflicts, are directly tied to the internal conflict your protagonist is facing. So it might be that they need to go off on some swashbuckling adventure, but in order to be successful, odds are the antagonist is better at swashbuckling than them. So they have to resolve that lone wolf style mentality they have so that them and their three friends can swashbuckle all at once against the one swashbuckler and ultimately emerge victorious. That makes it a lot more meaningful, and that makes the obstacles along the way more meaningful as well. So hopefully you have something a little more impactful in mind than 3v1 swashbuckling. But that's the best example I could come up with off the top of my head. But think about how your external conflict, the primary external conflict your protagonist faces, is can be resolved at the same time as their primary internal conflict, and why those two things relate together. I'm just going to take another moment here. I think conflict itself is worth a whole workshop. I often say something like that while we're doing workshops. So I'm going to add it to my ongoing list. Because it is big. It's a lot bigger than I can fit into this if we're trying to stay under the 2-hour mark. There's a lot more nuance to it. But I want you to also frame it from a character development perspective all the time, right? Because characters are so important to our stories. So even if the external conflict, the primary external conflict is your story, is the plot, always think about how that relates to character development. Okay. So we only have a few more sections here. Um, Before we kind of tie it all together. I pretty sure we'll be done by 4 Eastern again. So we'll have Q&A at the top of the hour here. But next we're moving into relationships. Characters rarely exist in isolation. In fact, I strongly encourage people not to write a story that is just your character by themselves for the majority of the tale. It's tough to have a well-developed character that way. It also kind of drags a little, but that's more prose and structure than anything else. Throughout the story, your character will start and change their relationships with others. This is a great way to find character development and to promote it. So, relationships present these opportunities to show a character's personality, motivation, and growth or descent in ways beyond just their actions. Right? The way that they act or feel towards other people is another way to show these changes. You can also use relationships to create conflict. Just spoke a lot about that, add emotional stakes, or force characters to confront hard truths, especially if you're using something like a foil character. But relationships, we talked about them for the backstory and how important they are there. They are also important for during the story, right? There's a lot of motivation that can come from from relationships. My apologies. A lot of motivation that can come from relationships, goals, conflicts, just all the stuff that we've been talking about so far are bundled up in relationships too, because they are another character mushing together with your main character, your protagonist, or whatever character you're focusing on. Maybe not physically mushing, depending on the genre that you're talking about, but still mushing. Okay. And we've already covered a couple types of relationships at the very beginning, but I'm just going to briefly mention them here as well. You have your familial relationships, you have friendships, you have romantic relationships, mentorships, and antagonistic relationships. There are pros and cons of each one, and each one can affect your character in different ways. We mentioned before how familial relationships are often the source of, or parental relationships specifically, are often the source of like self esteem and core beliefs. Mentorship is often where people will acquire the skills that they have for your novel. But it also might be the source of resentment if they ended on bad terms with a mentor. Antagonistic can be enemies, but it can also be rivalries. And those two things can exist at the same time with different characters, and they will look very different in the relationships. So we don't spend a ton of time on relationships here because I how do I phrase this in a way that's not controversial? I think relationships are a lot stronger in a backstory sense, and I think they will evolve as you plan your novel and as you flesh out well-developed characters along the way. And they're part of the planning process when you're talking about during the relationship, um, more so than a lot of the other stuff we talked about here. Um, Let me rephrase that a different way. If relationship is important to your plot, put a lot of forethought into it. Otherwise, you think about how relationships themselves will influence character development. How one character will force change or growth or obstacles onto another. That's where you're going to get the juiciest stuff for your relationships. So, for your exercise here, choose a conflict, external or internal, your choice. Then choose a relationship that your character has and one that will change over the story. So this can be romantic, familial, antagonistic, whichever one you want. Then, how does that relationship help or hinder your character's journey through that conflict? What stakes or tension are added, and what role does the other character play? I don't want to downplay relationships because I feel like that's may have been how it came off just before I listed off the exercise here. But if you take this exercise and frame relationships through this perspective, you're going to be able to use it a lot more to influence character development. I think a lot of people can add a relationship into a story, but if you don't do it in a way that influences development and conflict and goals, then it's just going to be a little shallow. And it's like, why did you have the relationship in the first place? Okay. A quick section here when change happens. So your characters are going to change throughout the story. So it only makes sense that their goals and motivations change too. You don't need to constantly be referring back to your character profile, every chapter and making sure their motivations and goals are still in line. However, revisit it and check it out to make sure you're on the right path when they're responding to conflict, when there are key events where the world itself has changed significantly, and at the midpoint, that really big pull the rug out from underneath them moment. Then, if you find that there's a change happening and you want to refine them, make sure to keep them true to their core beliefs, including the lie, until they've accepted the new truth, which comes at the end for the protagonist. Align them with their character's arc and consider the impact of external influences. There won't be a lot of change for like the deepest motivations and the most important internalized goals, but there will be change along the way. So if you've been doing the exercises and if you keep everything that we've spoken about before in mind, when there is that change, you'll have all of this information to help you make the right change. Because if you go and change a goal or motivation in a way that doesn't make sense and in a way that is way out of left field for a character, then the reader's going to be a little thrown off. And uh, I, when I was writing my second book, yeah, my second book, this happened to me. I had a character who I thought I knew the arc of, and I didn't do all of this work beforehand, so I didn't understand him fully, and I ended up giving him a goal change. And I got, I don't know, half a book in, And I realized that the way he was behaving, the goal that he was pursuing, and the motivation that was supposedly fueling it just didn't make sense. And so I ended up scrapping 30, 40,000 words or something like that to go back and reset everything because it just didn't make sense. The character became someone that I didn't like because I didn't think about all these things that were going into him, and all of the actions he took after just wouldn't work. The readers would hate it. So don't let that happen to you. Okay. Okay. So now we're at the climax, and the climax is a heck of a lot more than just the most thrilling part of your story. It is specifically for your protagonist, it is the culmination of their journey. So the stakes have got to be high. The goals, relationships, or even their life is on the line at this moment. The stakes cannot be higher than this. This is what the whole story's led to, right? It needs to be emotionally intense as well. So even if we're confident that the character is going to be okay, it needs to be intense for both reader and character. They need to feel threatened. They need to feel like failure is imminent and the result of failure is going to be catastrophic. And then, most importantly, the main internal and external conflict come to a head and force a massive decision. This is where the worst thing possible happens to them, and we make them confront the lie, right? The need comes up, we make them confront the lie, and whether or not they embrace the truth is up to them. Well, up to you. So, for the character's role, you're going to combine both conflicts together. In order to face and succeed against the external one, they need to first conquer the internal one. And the internal one usually fueled by that lie. That's why I keep drilling this down. They need to conquer that internal conflict, or the external conflict cannot be conquered. This is going to be a huge decision for them. Huge decision doesn't mean it has to be 2 or 3 pages of decision, but it needs to be monumental from their character development point of view, and for you and the reader to understand, hey, this is huge. This is not who they were before. And generally, their arc is going to resolve at this point, minus the new normal stage of it, like who they are afterwards. So when it comes to positive arcs, they overcome their internal flaws, conquer the lie, achieve a personal victory, might come at a cost though. For negative arcs, they succumb to their flaws or external pressures, they reject the truth and embrace the lie, and it leads to a tragic or cautionary outcome. Often, I think I've said this before already, with consequences for those around them. And then for flat arcs, when you resolve them here, the character remains steadfast in their beliefs or their nature, but their actions bring about change in the world. Again, it doesn't really relate to their lie because they are not changing as an individual, but this is where their conflict resolves as well. So, even if a bunch of explosions are going on, the climax is really about resolving the internal conflict. Again, I revisit to 2 slides ago where the internal conflict has to be wrapped up in order for the external conflict to be wrapped up as well. This means they have to face the lie. Characters' past trauma is brought to the forefront, and how they deal with it determines their fate. To succeed, they must reassess the belief caused by the big hurt. They must confront this lie. Okay. Internal victory is needed for them to be successful here. So external conflict should only be beatable once the character accepts their new truth, or in the case of a negative arc, rejects it. And most importantly, here, I really should have just bolted this whole last point. The success in the climax should have been previously impossible. If the character who started the story could succeed, if you took them and plopped them into this moment, then something's gone wrong somewhere along the way. Right? This moment, this obstacle should be impossible for that original character. And it's only through the changes and the trials and failures and success they've had through the last 100,000 words or however long it is that makes it doable for them to be successful here. Okay. And now, before we move on to this last putting it all together part, any questions about the climax? Because again, I think I got really passionate there and spoke a little more quickly. But I, again, want to just emphasize this last part, the previously impossible. If you keep that in mind, then yeah, it might mean more work. It might mean going back and fixing up the arc a little bit. But this is like a golden rule that you can kind of test your story on. If you finish your draft and you look at the climax and that initial character that, Frodo that we found in the Shire at the beginning, if he could be successful in this moment, then something's wrong. But if he couldn't be, if he's only successful because of the changes and because of rejecting or embracing the lie, then you've done it right here. Okay. If any questions do come up, I will address them afterwards because we are almost at the Q&A moment here. There's just one more thing that I want to point out, and that's putting it all together. We've covered a lot. Like, it's been an hour and 45 minutes since we started. There's been a lot of stuff here. Honestly, this could probably be like a whole day long workshop. So, Jacob, if you're still around, maybe we'll do that. But now I want to just emphasize exactly what you've consumed so far. So, this is who your character is. And I'm just going to make my own screen full screen for a sec here, just so I can point out, you have your values, beliefs, and flaws, your character traits, which are physical traits, personality traits, and behavioral traits, their voice, the relationships they have that includes everything from rivals to romances to family. You have their motivation, the society and culture that they come from that includes social status, culture, and geography, the goals that they have, and that's tied to the motivation, the key events from their past, which includes formative experiences and turning points, and then the big hurt and the lie. There is so much going into a character. And I don't point this out to be like a negative Nancy. I don't point it out to make you feel intimidated or make you feel like you're not doing enough. But I point it out to show you just how detailed you can get with a character and how much you can do to bring them to life and create someone that's exceptionally memorable. Like, we all have our favorite characters from literature, right? From movies, from whatever medium you want. And they are our favorite because the creators of them, the authors, the writers, they have taken all of these things and they've created a really cool character. And you have the opportunity to do that too. Now, in terms of character development, this is, a very crude roadmap of what their development looks like. You start with who your character is on the left. Then their character arc is the whole external, internal conflicts, weaving together, pushing them through ups and downs until you get to who your character will be. But if we take the last slide, and I know it's impossible to see unless you have like a 1,000-inch screen or something, who your character is all of that stuff that we've spoken about before. All of that stuff from before you start writing that first part of this workshop, then you put them through the character arc, which itself involves the external and internal conflicts. And then that gets them to who they will be. Character development is not a small thing, but if you do it right, then it becomes a character that readers remember. Right. So it's up to you to put in as much work as you want, to do as much legwork as you want. But I know you're passionate about it. Like, you're not here if you aren't passionate about writing. And part of writing is writing exceptional characters. We all want to write a character that becomes a reader's favorite character. And by thinking about things like this, and feel free to review this workshop and however much you need to. And again, I'll post the exercises on the cafe, but all of these things come together. If you take those and if you put in the work, you can have an awesome character. So with that said, I do have some bank questions here, but it is a Q&A time. So if you have any questions that you haven't asked so far, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm going to go and look at some of the ones that I have banked, and we'll start going through those. The first one I want to point out actually isn't even a question. And it was when Janet said, I wish I had this workshop before I'd written my book. One of the things that I truly think about all the time is how the book that I'm writing right now is the third book in a series, and it is so much better than the first book. Not, not necessarily better plot, but myself as an author, I am qualitatively better than I was when I wrote the first book, which was, I don't know, 5 years ago or something. And sometimes I have regrets about that. right? You want we have this idea that every book we put out there should be the absolute best that it can be. But what I tell myself is that the book that I put out there at the very beginning of my author career was the best book that it could be at the time. I didn't, for to be a little crude here, I didn't half-ass it. I didn't take shortcuts, and I don't think anyone here, if you spent the last 2 hours with me, I don't think you are either. So even if you wish your book was better, I'm there with you, but your book was the best it could be, and your next book is going to be even better. Quick one here, easy question. So Kara asking, will there be a place we can get the slides from this? I took tons of notes, but it would be helpful to have the visuals as well. This video is going to stay up until the end of November, until the end of the challenge. I'm going to post the exercises in the cafe. I'll see if I can get it to a manageable file size. I make these workshops in Canva. Canva is atrocious for making appropriate file sizes because everything's a picture, and so it downloads them all separately. But I will do my absolute best. If I can get it down to one that is uploadable, I'll upload it. Otherwise, I'll break it into sections, or I'll turn it into something a little less pretty. But I'll get it to you. Okay. So Ray asked, do you have any advice on how to deepen motivations or goals that you already have established? For context, I'm struggling with my antagonist being more compelling than my protagonist. Ray, I don't know if I remember asking if I interpreted that right, but I can't remember if I got the answer for that one. But if so, deepening motivations or goals that you already have established. When we say established, I'm assuming in your draft and not in a previously written work. I am seeing Carla and Jody here thanking me. Thank you for attending. I hope you found some value out of it. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in the 60-day challenge if you're following along with us. Um, for deepening motivations or goals that you already have established, look at what established those goals. So the deeper the motivation, the more it's tied to something that's super important or super foundational for a character. So your deepest motivations come from the lie established from the big hurt. That's probably the place I would go to first. And I know you write dark stuff as well. So go there and see what that traumatic moment was for them, and work your way from there. Now, if your antagonist is more compelling than your protagonist, I mean, I have the same problem. My antagonist freaking rocks, so entertaining to write. And that may very well be the case, but then look at other ways that your protagonist can be compelling as well. So their motivation has to be strong, it has to be deep, it has to make sense. Their goals have to be compelling as well. But if like see how you can use conflict to make them more exciting, see how you can develop relationships so that it's not just their motivation and goals that they care about, but it's others now as well, and that adds a little bit more depth to them. If your antagonist is just a heck of a lot more entertaining to read and their goals are more riveting and your readers are rooting for them more than your protagonist, maybe your antagonist is your protagonist then. Maybe this means that you're doing a heck of a lot of revision, but it's actually your villain's story. Let's see here. I hope that made sense. Again, it's tough. I think that's more like a 15-minute one-on-one conversation. um, Resist asked, it seems that the 9 steps, the character arc 9 steps, would work very well with the hero's journey. I'm thinking about how these steps would be fleshed in a fast-paced thriller, say with the Fichtean plot structure. So it depends on the thriller. A lot of thriller protagonists have a flat arc, and so they don't have that super pivotal change, that internal change that we talked about a lot in this, which is fine, and that's kind of par for the course in the genre. If you do want them to have that arc, then most of that Fichtean plot structure, that you know a super exciting moment and then short lull. Sorry, my finger's off screen. And then exciting and then lull and exciting and lull. That's in your rising action, right? And then you have a really exciting moment. That's the midpoint. I'm a firm believer that any story structure can really go back to the 3-act structure. It's just even the hero's journey, you can more or less frame them on the same map. So when it's a fast-paced thriller, you have all of these smaller try-fail cycles that happen repeatedly back to back that make it so exciting. But if you want to have a thorough arc, just think about those as ways to test the lie that the character believes to be true. I mean, every single one should be pressing them to change, and they aren't going to change until that very climactic moment. Da, 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 da. Ray, you're very welcome. Jane, one of my character's goals is to live a quiet life, but as a writer, I don't plan to let them have one. Should I force them to have a more aspirational goal? I don't think so. Well, again, it's tough for a specific question like that, but there are a lot of characters who want to have a quiet life. And so their goal might not just be a quiet life, but peace or security or comfort. Right? And all of those things come from a quiet life. So maybe look for something more foundational to that. Look at what their core values are or what their core beliefs might be. And that's where their motivation is going to stem from. If they don't have a big hurt, that traumatic moment, and they don't have a lie that results from it, then you're really looking at those foundational elements to drive them to come back to a place of security and comfort. Right? But a quiet life is more than that, even if we only think of it as a quiet life. That said, you really need to put in the work then to think about what pushed them out of the quiet life that they had or is pushing them away from it, and why they are working so hard to get back there. Okay. Oh, they did have a big hurt. Okay, perfect. Perfect. Yeah, so then the motivation makes even more sense if they have a big hurt and they want a quiet life to kind of deal with that. But then do they if they have a big hurt, that means that they probably have a lie that results from it. And so is it the lie telling them that they want a quiet life, and is that truly what they want then? And it might be, right? But sometimes the lie misinforms them about their ultimate goal. Okay. Any other bank questions here? I know I promised. Okay. So Kara asked here, is it possible to import character notes from one story outline to another? Let me pull up Dabble real quick. Okay. Bear with me here while I navigate the wild world of sharing my screen. Okay, and let me rearrange my windows so that I can show things here. So the easiest way to do it, or I mean the only way to do it, but here's my 60-day project that I'm working on. So if we want to take, say, a character, and here's my character profile for my protagonist, Naimir. Click on the three dots here. You copy character. I'll go home. I just go into this copy of the world building Bible I have. Paste character. Boom. Everything that was there before is now in there. Though you can do the same with really anything. If I want the story notes, so let's say I don't have my world building template or my world building Bible fleshed out yet, but you can copy this folder. Same thing. Copy folder, paste it into another one. Super easy. You don't need to like highlight and copy and paste. It's all just Dabble remembers what it is. And I think we have our templates down here. So you can copy. I mean, you could do this with a normal character profile, but I can go over here and then in templates, I can paste the character. And now I have this as a template to use here if I wanted to add from templates. Boom. Easy as pie. Okay. And I know we had a couple other demonstration things. Right. The boss told me that I have to show off property lists. So if you use the best character template ever, it already has a bunch of property lists. But let's go into our unnamed character here. No, we'll name it Jacob, the boss. So you can type, you can do whatever you want. Everyone knows that. You can make a bulleted list just by hitting that hyphen button. No problem there. But a little while ago, we introduced these things called property lists. So if you are on a blank line here, you click this little plus button and start with a property list header. And let's say character traits. And I'm going to hit enter, and that will automatically, I don't know if you can see it on a shared screen or not, because I know some things get lost in the definition, but there is a faint line that pops up when you hit enter there. So what you can then do is put in something like, wow, I can't type when people are watching. Physical description. You hit tab, and that'll put you on the other side of the line, and then tall, muscular, super cool. Then if you hit enter, it will do it again. So you can create another trait category, tattoos. Super scary ones, heart with mom. And you can just go about that. You hit enter again, it'll get rid of it. You can go back to your normal typing. What I've done, or what we've done in the template, is broken it up into different categories like demographics, physical appearance, history. These are all property headers, and then property lists down here. And you'll note if I go to birth date, tab, and then type away. This is a great way for organizing it. It keeps everything so pretty. And then you'll see here, I've already filled in some of my stuff for this week for our challenge stream. Jane's right. I think that, I mean, I could show off a bunch of stuff in Dabble all day long, and maybe we will I'll show some more stuff off in the challenge live stream later this week, which I will shamelessly plug now. Thursday, 2:00 Eastern, same time that this started. Right here, we will be doing the next 60-day novel challenge live stream, where we will be discussing week 2 work, which is all about characters. So you're going to take everything that you learned here, you're going to go through the exercises that we have in the 60-day challenge. You're going to come out with some really great characters on the other end, especially your protagonists. For a 50,000 word novel, if that's what you're aiming for, I say your protagonist is the one you really want to flesh out, and then your antagonist and your secondary characters that are important. There is room, for example, in the exercises for tertiary characters. That's just if you have an idea. Don't spend too much time on those. Last thing I will say is that, again, this was kind of a second go over of a Dabble Premium workshop. And included with Dabble Premium is all the other stuff that I get to do during the day. So workshops like this, we do office hours, deep dives, bonus resources. We have guest speakers coming in every now and then. So if that is something that interests you, you can always join me in the premium tier of subscription, and you get access to all that stuff, including more community stuff on Storycraft Cafe, where we keep all of these resources. Otherwise, I'm going to make my face big again. Hello, everyone. Well, resist. I will shamelessly plug that, but I do want to thank everyone for joining me today and for participating and asking questions and doing the exercises and just joining us on the 60-day novel challenge. This has been really fun. I love doing workshops like this. I hope you found a lot of value in it, and I hope it's stuff that you think about as you're creating your characters going forward. Again, I will post the exercises from this in the cafe. I'll do it under the, you know what? I'll do it under the announcements. Yeah, I'll do it under the announcements so it's easy to find. But I appreciate you swinging by. So thank you, everyone. And then a quick question here from Resist. What is the Dabble Premium content access about and how to join it? Is it the same as the sub level for Dabble, or is it a channel? It is. So Dabble has 3 levels of subscription, the actual product itself, not here on YouTube. So the premium level, which is our highest one, gives you all the tools that Dabble has, including co-authoring and word tools. But we also have more on that. So we do a monthly workshop. We bring in guest workshops every now and then. You get access to the premium newsletter, which is a bi-weekly newsletter in addition to our normal weekly one. That has resources, access to fun events like this. Hank was antagonizing me throughout the channel during the in the chat during this. Him and I get together every other Friday now for office hours, where it's just submit your questions or come in and ask them there, and we'll just answer them. On top of that, we do a bunch of bonus resources like deep dive articles and free resources that come with stuff like this. So all that fun stuff, that's what I'm in charge of here at Dabble, in addition to these fun events like the 60-day challenge. So if you want to join me, you can go to dabblewriter.com and manage your account there. But I do appreciate everybody joining me today. This has been a lot of fun. If you have any other questions, drop them in the Storycraft Cafe in our discussion space for the challenge. Otherwise, I'll see you all later.